Hi, everyone. How are you? It's so good to be with you. So this is week 6. Can you believe it? 6 out of 10. I don't know how it happened, but we're more than halfway through and you're doing amazing. For the most part, you all are keeping up and you're invested, and it's just I don't know. You're a really great class. So thank you. Thank you for everything you're doing. Okay, so week 6 is a really every week in the 19th century is a complicated week. I can hear my dog snoring. It's a little distracting. um, every week in the 19th century is a hard week to go over, right? In this class, I mean, every week is a hard week. There's always something really traumatic happening. There's always something where I'm like, oh, has any of this changed? Right? Like calling for secession or immigration laws. And I don't, have we gotten anywhere? It sort of seems repetitive, right? History does absolutely repeat itself. But so what we want to look at here with this week in particular is that this is another week where we're doing basically in a 15-week semester, we're doing 2 weeks put together. So the end of the Civil War would be its own week, and then the Reconstruction era is its own time period. It's 12 years long. It's its own time period. So that would be its own week too. But because we're an accelerated class, this is one of the weeks where we mush them together. So keep all this in mind when we're going. There's a lot this week and there's a lot of things to talk about. But what's really cool, I think, about this week is that you can take a lot of the topics that I'll mention or just talk about briefly, and you can use those topics and cover them as your final project. So, to throw off a few, so like last week we talked about Dred Scott. So there's things that I'm mentioning that we're talking about briefly, but maybe we're not going into deep detail. Again, because we're accelerated and this is a survey class and we just go fast, right? So you could write your final project on Dred Scott. So you take what we went over and then just do a deep dive into that topic. Another one that students often really like to write about that we're starting this week is the concept of reparations, and who gets reparations and why do they get reparations. And that is not as simple as you think, because people have gotten reparations in this country. Multiple people have gotten reparations, but who? So the big question is who? And why, right? Like, was it political? Was it actually really helpful? Was it reparations in the sense that it repaired something? Or was it sort of token reparations, like here's $20, let go of the past? And like, again, who? So for example, as I'll go over in a little bit, somebody did get reparations after slavery. Believe it or not, right? There's this big argument about should African Americans get reparations or not? Who has gotten reparations before them, right? Technically, Native Americans got reparations in the form of the reservation system. But as we all know, the reservation system is horrifying, and really complicated. And so, is that reparation? Like, does anybody want those reparations? That's a complicated thing, right? Being forced to be on welfare, having no employment, no health care. Like, I don't think a lot of people would choose that if that wasn't a system that was imposed upon them, right? The positive, of course, is that people get to be in their cultural element together, right? Like on the res together. It's sort of the upshot. But who got reparations after the Civil War? Somebody did. Who got reparations? So this would be a good paper topic. Who got reparations after the Civil War and why? All right, so I'm going to leave you hanging on that question. And then, of course, famously, this isn't in our time period, but Japanese Americans got reparations for Japanese internment. It was 3 years of Japanese internment, and 2/3 of the Japanese people that were put in internment camps in the Midwest were American citizens. Not that they needed to be, but they were. And so Japanese Americans did get in reparations. Again, I don't know if it was very helpful, considering all that they went through. But so that's an example of, again, reparations, but like maybe more tokenism, right? Like the idea of it rather than, did it really help anybody's life? I don't know, right? So we're going to swing back to who got reparations after the Civil War. Write that in your notes. We're coming back. All right. So you ended page 142 in Remini. You ended on this idea of Lincoln and like, who is Lincoln? He's been held up as this amazing, martyr almost, right? Because he was killed by John Wilkes Booth, murdered by John Wilkes Booth, and at the theater. And, it's like this famous story you can Google for the whole narrative. So he just got sort of martyred, right? He's like this victim of assassination. And it was like this whole big thing. But he was a complicated president. It's not just cut and dry, maybe, about Lincoln. And you can remember when he said, quote, "I have no purpose directly or indirectly to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists." So we have this, again, just from last week, we have this mythologization of the United States, especially the North. And us Northerners love to be like, we never had slavery. We weren't involved in that, blah, 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 blah. But that's not actually accurate. Lincoln was not an abolitionist, right? He believed that slavery was morally wrong, you remember? But, he also believed in colonization. And you can go back and read about what that means in his context, right? For his wording of that. He believed in Black rights, right? He believed in Black equality, which is very different than saying, I believe in human equality, right? Like human rights, because we are all human. He wasn't saying that. He was saying, we're all human, but there should be white rights and Black rights. And I think that's something that a lot of people still think, right? I think that's horrifyingly something that, a lot of places in the United States still sort of think, right? That it's not American rights or human rights. And I think some people think that men should have certain rights that women shouldn't have. And I think that some people think that straights should have some rights that the gays shouldn't have, and, or cis people and trans people. And I think there's a lot of division, this idea, this concept of separate but equal. And of course, we know that if you're separate, there's always going to be a hierarchy, right? You're not going to separate like this. You're going to separate like this, right? You're not going to separate equally and stay on the same level. You're going to separate into a hierarchy. You just are, right? That's human nature. And that's the structural racism and sexism and homophobia and like all of it, right? So, President Lincoln gives this inaugural address in 1861, and he declares, if I could do it without freeing the slaves, I would. And everyone's, the abolitionists are like, boo, piss, right? And the Southerners are like, so what side are you on? It just was very confusing. So then, of course, the Civil War happens, and you can read about that in your book. The Union had over 350,000 soldiers die. The Confederacy had over 250,000 soldiers die. It was a very bloody war. It was also a ton of deaths due to illnesses, diseases, amputations, right? Remember, there weren't hospitals, there weren't like med schools yet, like that old joke that a dentist is anybody with a pair of pliers. Right? A surgeon is anybody with a needle and thread. So a lot of the deaths were from wounds. But also remember, we're not talking about a war where, you have AK-47s and you're like mowing people down. Like now, you're not talking about bombs that you drop from, 50,000 miles in the sky, wherever they're dropped from. You're talking about that you have to shoot somebody within 20 feet of you, right? You're knifing people, you're using knives, you're using bayonets on the ends of rifles. And then you would like shoot the rifle and have to reload with gunpowder, right? So the Civil War is in and of itself very politically fraught, very emotionally fraught, but also psychologically, physically. It was just a really hand-to-hand combat kind of war. It was a lot of disease and illness. It was just a really gross war, right? Like physically gross war. And it was just really problematic in multiple ways. It just was very problematic. So remember too that Lincoln passed the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 and it kind of did nothing, right? So that's another topic that's a really good topic for final project. You know, like what was the purpose of the Emancipation Proclamation if it didn't actually do anything? That's in your reading. This one, I think. I think it's in this one, the trigger events of the Civil War. I think it was that link from last week. So they're talking about like why the Emancipation Proclamation didn't really do anything, like that it didn't emancipate anybody really. So Lincoln gets assassinated. You know, all of these things are happening 3 hours after Lincoln is assassinated. This is, by the way, chapter 6. This is where chapter 6 starts. President Andrew Johnson takes over. And this is where we get to the aftermath of the Civil War that becomes incredibly important because Andrew Johnson is a sick fart. You know, I was going to say something different. He is racist AF. He is really problematic. Immediately, he undoes what little Lincoln had done, right? Because Lincoln did end the war. Lincoln did abolish slavery. He did, you know, set the 13th Amendment going. Like he did all these things. Let's not, you know, totally knock Lincoln. But Andrew Johnson comes in, y'all. God, Andrew Johnson. I hate him so much. I shouldn't say that. He's president and I'm a historian. Dr. Morgan has no opinions on Andrew Johnson. Okay, I'll just tell you what he did and you can make up your own mind. How about that? So you'll read about this in this chapter, but the main thing that he did is he exempted and gave amnesty to the Confederacy. So when we talk about, I think we've mentioned this before, when we talk about like denazification, right? When after World War II and Germany trying to reconcile with the Nazis and like, what do we do? And we as Germans like went along with this. Or we were fighting this, we were rebels, we were hiding the Jews, right? There's like all these different people in Germany. There's German Jews, there's all these people, you know, and Nazis who were hiding and whatever. The process that they decided was denazification. That's, you can write that down, Google it. It's like a real thing. That's the process of getting the Nazis out of their culture, denazifying. And here's my point about this, is that we never did this, right? We at no point in our history, this is just factual, at no point after the Civil War or during Reconstruction did we denazify the United States. We never confronted the virulent racism. We never confronted head on the institution of slavery and the fact that our country was founded on the genocide of natives and their removal and like purposeful extinction by Andrew Jackson, right? Or attempted, right? Purposeful extermination by Andrew Jackson. And then Andrew Johnson, at the end of the Civil War, you know, very intentionally forgiving and absolving all of the secessionists, all of the landowners, all of the whites in the South, and saying if they take a loyalty oath, loyalty oath, they're fine, and let's just move forward. And worse yet, I might get emotional, I'm sorry. He, among other people, it's not just him, but other people in the government and other presidents, gave reparations in the form of money, like funded money, to white slave owners. Why? Why did white Confederates who seceded, who treasonously stood against the United States, the president, and the Constitution, why did they get reparations? I get like a little emotional. Because of their lost property, right? Right. Because of their lost property. So African Americans post-slavery, Jews post-World War II, all of a sudden are just dropped into the world with no money, no home, right? Because they're kicked off the plantation or they're kicked out of concentration camps, right? It's the same, right? I mean, it's different, but it's the same. No home, no money, no job, because now the South is decimated, right? Like Germany was just bombed. So there's no employment. There's no money to be had. There's no jobs to be had. So imagine, literally, I just now am freed from enslavement. I say, right? I'm done. I'm out of slavery. I am walking out of my plantation, give the big middle finger to the plantation, to the slave owner. I spit on the ground that they are on, and I walk out. Where do I go? Where do I go? Right? Where do I go? I don't know where my husband is. I don't know where my children were sold off to. I don't have a job. I don't have a home. I don't know where any of my relatives are. I don't know anything. I can't read. I can't write. It's illegal for me to testify in a court of law. It's illegal for me to go to school. It's illegal for me to get a bank account. Where am I going? You know what people did? They turned right back around and went back to the plantation. What else are you going to do? Where are you going to go? Right? So, okay, sorry. This just really freaking pisses me off. Okay, so, sorry. So, it wasn't until later that the Great Northern Migration happens, right? In different parts, but the Great Northern Migration that creates Harlem, that creates the Harlem Renaissance, right? In the 1920s and 30s and 40s. That doesn't happen for another like 80 years, right? Because African Americans at no point were allowed to build wealth. They weren't allowed to have property, right? The whole 40 acres and a mule thing was like not real, right? And a lot of the times that land was then taken from natives. It's like it's just 40 acres and a mule. We'll get to that. It's complicated. Okay, so African Americans turned back around and went back to the plantations, oftentimes where they were just trying to leave because they have nothing else, right? And nowhere else to go. So what happens in that system, though, because slavery is legally abolished, is that the sharecropping system comes out. And the sharecropping system says, I now, the white owner, I now am going to lend you the land, right? And I'm going to lend you the tools, and I'm going to lend you the seeds to plant, and you can go plant and like grow all this stuff. But then what? You got to pay me back for the seeds. You got to pay me back for the use of the tools. You got to pay me back for the use of the horse. You got to pay me back, blah, 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 blah. Right. So now I'm the former Black slave. I'm a sharecropper. And I now I don't have $1. So I have to borrow, right, from my former owner. I have to borrow this money, do all the labor, then pay him back the money with interest. Right. So what am I left with? I got like $5 in my pocket, right? So at what point am I going to be able to save enough money to buy a house, to buy my own land so I can get out of this cycle of poverty? How am I going to do that? Not, right? So anybody who's like, slavery was abolished all these years ago, it wasn't, right? Because then in the 1900s, that's your next history class, 103, there's redlining and there's, right, all sorts of stuff that keep people from still, right, buying houses and having generational wealth. So not only do African Americans post-Civil War have nothing, they are given less than nothing in order to restart and reconstruct their lives. And instead, white Americans who have been accumulating generational wealth for 400 years and, 4 centuries before that, who have bank accounts, who own all the land, who are allowed to get married and then combine fortunes, who can go to court and sue for their own rights. So they're being protected by the law, right? They're being protected by the Constitution. They're being protected by everything, right? Every source, all the things. They now are making money off sharecropping. And because of their loss of property when their slaves were freed, they got reparations. So I'm going to share my screen because you might not even believe me. You might not even believe me that this is true. Okay, so here's slave reparations. So here's the idea. Here's one example of a Compensation Emancipation Act. So celebration of emancipation. And then this is the owners of enslaved people get reparations for their loss of property. So here's a short documentary on that. It was most often, you again can do more research in your final project. It was generally about $300 per person. Okay, $300 per person. So what's really interesting to do is a compare and contrast between, this like slave owner reparations and contemporary arguments for, so you can just Google this. I just Googled the slave reparations for Confederates, right? Like how much, and what is it? And you can also just look like the 40 acres and a mule and why that was kind of a joke and, why it wasn't real. And then now they talk about African-American slave reparations for the 21st century. And it's $97 trillion based on so many hours of forced labor between 1619 and 1865 with 6% interest. Right? You got to get that interest in there. So $97 trillion is owed to Black Americans for their unpaid labor. And arguably, again, you can sort of make these arguments, as we're going to do with the fugitive slave law being the beginnings of the police force, and Black codes being the Jim Crow South. Then this lack of African-American reparations leading to, like a class and racial hierarchy, right? That we still have today, right? Whites have more money today still. Okay, it's a lot to take in. It's a lot to process. And again, just always trigger warnings with this topic. So the other thing I really want to talk about that's very important, but again, I'll stop talking in a minute, I promise, is that and you'll read about it in here, is that Johnson gave absolution, or amnesty and individual pardons to those in the South, and did so through what we call this oath of allegiance. So the Confederates had to sign, and if they couldn't read and write, which was highly possible, especially of poor whites, then they had to, like put an X, kind of thing, and sign this oath of loyalty, right? So it's either the post-Civil War loyalty or oath of allegiance. It's called a couple different things, but this is what it is. So here is our primary source document, right? Remember, primary source documents are the actual thing, right? The actual thing itself, not somebody's opinion of them. So this is what it says. It says, I, whoever of whatever, county in North Carolina, do solemnly swear or affirm in the presence of Almighty God that I will henceforth faithfully support, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States and the Union of the States thereunder, right? So all the states under the Constitution. And that I will, in like manner, abide by and faithfully support all laws and proclamations. Proclamations, that's the Emancipation Proclamation, right? And 13th Amendment, which have been made during the existing rebellion with reference to the emancipation of slaves. So help me God. And then they sign and date. Okay. So what's happening here? And do we buy this? Like, do we buy this concept of, sure, just sign this like oath of it's like oath of allegiance? And President Johnson said it's all forgiven. Like, let's just move on. What do we think about that? What do we think about this oath of loyalty, right? I don't know. I have a lot of feelings about that. So let's go through the modules and we'll talk about it, because the other thing that happened, so that's the end of the Civil War, right? And then I'm not going to go through Reconstruction. I'm going to let the module do that, but Remini does a great job. It's chapter 6, right? And we're week 6 in chapter 6. That's cool. That's a nice coincidence. So we're going to talk about how the South was destroyed and Black codes and the Freedmen's Bureau. So that's all Reconstruction, right? So this is just the end of the Civil War. Just so many people died and so much badness happened, all because the South seceded, really, and wanted to keep slavery as an economic and social institution. So remember, too, that there were a number of states who didn't want to keep slavery, and or thousands and thousands more whites that didn't have slaves in the South than people who did, right? It was very expensive. You had to have a lot of money to buy slaves, right? So it's, it was the minority that had slaves, right? That could afford to have slaves. It was like Jefferson, and we talked about that last week. So this time we're talking about whites who are not necessarily invested in slavery because they have slaves. They can't afford it. They're invested in enslavement because of the culture of it, because they're invested in, we'll learn about this later, their whiteness. They're invested in white privilege. They're invested in wealth privilege. Even if they're poor whites, they're invested in this idea that somebody's less than them. Even if they're like poor whites, bottom of the barrel, there's still somebody beneath them in their minds. And that's what they want to keep. They want to keep the culture and ideology of white supremacy. And I'm going to argue to you that we have never denazified that. We really have never confronted the systemic, psychological, economic, emotional impact and life of white supremacy. And it's exactly why our world is the way that it is. That's my supposition, right? That's Dr. Morgan's philosophy. So coming back to denazification, what the Germans did to denazify was then to ban this, to ban anything having to do with Nazis. You could not trade in it. You could not, anything with a swastika was burned, banned. And it wasn't just this like banning of Nazis and their ideology. Like for us, that would be, you know, banning the Confederate flag, banning these, you know, Jefferson Davis statues, Andrew Jackson statues, Andrew Johnson. What bill is he on? I think he's on a bill. Right, like saying, no, we're not going to uphold these people as heroes, as good Americans. They're not. This isn't who stands for America, right? We never did that, right? We never complicated Lincoln's memory. We never complicated anything. So the other thing that they did to denazify in Germany was that they created whole lesson plans around the Nazis. So they didn't ignore it, and they didn't say, oh, I'm colorblind, I don't see color. Oh, you know, nothing bad happened. Well, it'll just never happen again. Let's just not talk about it, right? Not that. The opposite of that. They put it in your face. They put it in they require it in every textbook. You, before high school, whatever their version of high school is, have to go take a trip to Auschwitz and see how the Nazis burned, starved, poisoned, threw babies onto the electric fences, all that stuff. You have to go see it. And just the terror of it. It's required. So what would happen if we had been required to denazify, right? What would happen if Reconstruction era, which is the 12 years after the Civil War, right, starting in 1865, what would happen if we as a country said, we are going to confront this. We're going to confront why white people feel the need to be above Black people. We're going to confront why this idea of anybody being less than anybody else is even an issue. Like, why do we even have that? Why can't we be based in human rights? We're going to confront what even allowed the South to secede. Let's confront all of this, right? That never, ever happened. And in large part, not to blame him for everything, but it's because of Andrew Johnson, because he immediately went and just pardoned everybody, gave white folks reparations, like just did the opposite of that. He swept everything under the rug and was like, let's just, you know, let's make it worse, basically. So you're going to read about that in Remini, chapter 6. So what happens in the rest of this chapter, I'm just going to go through the module with you so you can see. So what happens in the rest of this chapter in Remini is that, so here's just a little brief overview of like the causes and then the effects. The effects are that, one, whiteness and Blackness in a racial caste hierarchy gets totally cemented, right? It gets cemented. At no point does anybody try to find some kind of equality. At no point does anybody confront the legacy and institution of slavery and do anything about it, not even remotely. Reconstruction, I always put it in quotes because it's the most bullshit ever, right? They did no reconstructing whatsoever. And here's part of the reason why there's this huge divide between North and South that continues to this day. So one of the parts is this. One of the parts is the fact that the South was decimated. The South, as you'll learn on page 157, was completely just blown apart. I mean, it was bombed to no end, right? So the South had nothing. And maybe that was their punishment, right, for causing the Civil War in the first place. I don't know, but they were really decimated. So you can see just nothing but rubble. I mean, buildings just bombed out. So what's the problem with this? And there's a whole bunch of videos in here. And I put this Khan Academy. I don't usually use other sources like that. I usually, you know, make my own videos, but it's a really good video. So watch that in your spare time. So what do we care that the South is bombed? Like maybe that's their punishment. That's what they get, right? Well, we care about it because in the North, we had not that level of terrorism because the war was generally fought in the South, right? The North went to the South to fight the rebels and the secessionists. So the South got all bombed out, and slavery was stopped, and the plantation system stopped. And well, I mean, it didn't stop, but right, it was ending. And cotton manufacturing stopped because the fields were burned, the plantations were burned, right? So all of a sudden the South halts, right? And again, I'm not justifying this. Maybe that's like what happens to them. You start a war, you deal with it, right? I get it. However, we're looking at the effects of the Civil War. And one of them is that the South never recovers economically, right? Their whole entire economic system was just on the backs of Black folks, right? It was just on the backs of enslavement. And when enslavement was legally forced to end, and, politically, economically, like everything was forced to end, it stopped. And the South produced nothing, right? They didn't have another huge cash crop. They had tobacco and, coal, and they had some things, but nothing like cotton, and having your entire workforce be unpaid, right? So you are literally just raking in profits, 100% profit, right? So all of that stops. While the South is now decimated and just leveled and, right, just done for. The North, right? We have Maine, Massachusetts, lumber, paper mills. We have Massachusetts, Boston, seafood, right? Lobsters, all that stuff from Maine. We have New York, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., right? Like all right here. Baltimore, Maryland was a huge spot. Rhode Island, believe it or not, was a huge spot for commerce, for trade, they all had ports, right? They all had ports there. So the North took off. We became Philly, New York, DC, right? This is when we became like real cities, and immigration started happening, right, from Eastern Europe, and all this stuff started happening. And so the North went in the tank, right, and was just bombed out from the war. The North was booming. And so forever, they sort of went this way, right? And it was just a division that has never been healed, right? It's just something that has never been gotten over. We have never been the United States. So the South, and now I'm just going to list off some things to you. So can you write these in your notes? Because this is what I want you to focus on. So in the South, what ends up happening are the Freedmen's Bureau, which is an attempt to have recovery. But why doesn't that work? And that's going to be the lessons that you see in the modules. The Freedmen's Bureau, and like, what's the positive of it? And then, does it work? Does it not work? And why? Like, why doesn't it work out? Freedmen's Bureau. The second are Black codes. And we're going to look at the Black codes, actual Black codes that are primary source documents from Mississippi, Missouri, Alabama. And what are the Black codes, and like, what's their purpose? What's the function of the South creating an entire legal system just of their own in the South that did nothing but segregate, dehumanize, marginalize, right? And disenfranchise, right? Mostly just disenfranchise, right? So we're going to look at Black codes, which eventually became the Jim Crow laws. So again, there's this idea of, you can have prejudices. Everybody does. It's a racist society. It's a classist society. It's a sexist society, right? So everybody's got, some things in their mind that are prejudicial, right? But it's different when we act on that. That's racism. It's the difference between prejudice and racism, right? Bias and sexism. If we don't hire somebody because of that belief, that's an ism, right? If we don't date somebody, if we don't go into a store, if we're rude to somebody, if we act on those prejudices, right, that like we just have in a racist society, right? And sexist society, yeah? I mean, I can't tell you how many times in Home Depot people say like, can I give you a hand there, little lady? And I'm like, it's a 2x4. I'm going to hit you with it before I like let you carry this for me. Right. And they don't mean any harm. I'm not rude about it, but it's this idea though, that like women are less than, it's everywhere, right? It's all the time. It's our everyday life. Yeah. So we have all of that. And so the difference is when that gets codified or codified, however you want to say it, CODIFY, to codify something means to make it into law, So we can have our prejudices. You can dislike left-handed people. You can dislike, people who wear mismatching socks. Like, you can have your prejudices, but you don't get to act on them. That's illegal, or soon will be, right? According to our time period, right? It's illegal. It's immoral to act on that, right? To make decisions and actions based on that prejudice is a violation of human rights, right? So what the Jim Crow laws did is they took the prejudices of the Black codes and they codified it into law. So the Jim Crow laws said things like, no two Black people are allowed to gather in a group together, same as enslavement, right? It's Black people have to sit in the back of the bus or front of the bus. It's all the laws, right? I'm going to show, I don't want to give away too much because you're going to see it in the unit. You're going to see in the module. So the Jim Crow laws became the law until the 1960s. So the Jim Crow laws are those laws that we see that are the Black laws and the white laws, the segregation laws, the like, here's the Black train car and here's the white train cars. Here's the colored water fountain and the white water fountain. And this is the Plessy v. Ferguson, separate but equal. And of course, as we say, nobody who's separate is ever equal, right? If they were equal, we would all be together. So all the images in your mind of, the colored quote unquote water fountain is just rusty and the water's dirty, and the white water fountain is perfect and pristine and clean and has clean water, and right. So again, nothing separate is ever equal. And that was the lay of the land until the 1965 Civil Rights Act. So it's 100 years of literal Black oppression, disenfranchisement, marginalization, dehumanization, right? And that starts in Reconstruction. Reconstruction era was 12 years of terrorism of Black people by white Southerners. And then the codification of all of that into law. So it's the exact opposite of denazification, the exact opposite. There was no healing. There was no reconstruction. There was no sense of, let's navigate this racism. They doubled down on the racism in the South, right? By creating these laws and by creating separate and equal. Okay. So let me just go through the module. So we're all on the same page. So here's the decimation of the South. And again, the South taking no sort of responsibility for that, but saying like, it's the North's fault, it's Black people's fault, right? Rather than saying like, we started this war and we sort of brought this on ourselves. Okay, so here is the case study. We're talking about the Freedmen's Bureau, carpetbaggers, what all this is. So we would look at this image and say, what is happening here? And if this dude in the middle is the Freedmen's Bureau, is like the representation of the Freedmen's Bureau, then what is he doing, right? What is his purpose and function? And what does it mean that he's got both hands telling both sides to sort of stop, right? So we would do some analysis of that if we were in person. And then here's more on the Confederates in the South who were given reparations. And I have an article linked there. Okay, and then now here is Reconstruction. I should put their Reconstruction amendments, or like Reconstruction era amendments. So here's all the pages for Remini and the amendments themselves. So The 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment, and then the Civil Rights Act of 1875. But again, remember that still African Americans were not enfranchised, allowed wealth, allowed equal access, allowed education, allowed anything. There was Black schools, Black banks, and anytime there was like Black Wall Street, that was very real. If you've never heard of that, please write that down, Black Wall Street. It was burned to the ground, right? Literally burned to the ground. So anytime that African Americans tried to get a step up, they were, decimated. Okay. So we call these the Reconstruction Amendments. We call these the Reconstruction era, sort of the main things. And again, you're going to go through all of this. So what are the ways in which African Americans weren't even allowed to vote? One of the Jim Crow laws was a poll tax. There were literacy tests. So if you as a country have kept an entire population from legally being able to read and write, then what do you do to keep them from voting and having their voice heard in politics and in the government? You make a literacy test. You say, you have to write all these pages about the Constitution or else you can't vote. Well, that kept a lot of people from voting, right? Or if you're a country and you hate poor people like we do in this country, then you say, okay, if you want to vote, great, give me $20. Right? Well, then you just kicked out all the poor whites, all the Native Americans, all the Chinese railroad workers. You just got rid of all the African Americans who are in sharecropping. You just got rid of 3/4 of the population with one poll tax, right? So this is why we have arguments around this idea of, emancipation wasn't 1865, it was 1965, right? Because JFK and then he was assassinated. Lyndon B. Johnson passed the actual acts because JFK was shot in his car. So we have the 14th Amendment, the 13th Amendment, and Civil Rights Act of 1866. This is all in, all the pages are here at the top. You can see all of that's here. So really read Remini this week. And then I have this little blurb on, the 12 years of Reconstruction. And that it was supposed to be this, right? It was supposed to be this, the North and the South shaking hands. And of course, the argument is why, then here's what you're going to, teach yourself through these videos is why is Reconstruction actually said to be worse than slavery, right? And in large part, it's because of the Jim Crow laws. So you can see this Black family and their poor little baby here. And that's why is this worse than slavery, right? And one of the reasons is because of the Jim Crow laws. But the other reason is because of the Klan. So the Ku Klux Klan ends up becoming really popular. And by 1900, they have millions and millions of followers. And, it becomes a lot. So you have, this is the bill put out by, God, I'm blanking on his name. He just passed away last year. John, Conyers? No, isn't that Conyers? Anyway, lots of famous people have worked on HR 40, and HR 40 is African American reparations, and it never passed, right? It never passed. So this is just something I thought you would find interesting. Again, you can make this your final paper topic. And please, you guys, make sure that you're going back through the modules all week long, not just to do the posts on Wednesday and the peer replies by Friday, but also to read these read and leads. Some of these read and leads have been phenomenal, and they're teaching you so much. So just keep that in your mind. All right, so the last thing I need to tell you is that there's a quiz. It's quiz 3 out of 5, I think. And it's the Civil War before, during, and after. And it's basically Remini chapters 5 and 6. And of course, everything in the modules. And then you have 25 minutes. It's a lot of, here I put 30 minutes. And again, I make it a short amount of time because I don't want people to Google the answer. Sorry, I have the hiccups because I've been talking so much. I don't want people to Google the answers. So if I give you an hour to do this quiz, then people just sit there and Google the entire time. It's horrible. And you're not showing me anything, and I'm going to give you a 0. So what I need you to do is go through and take notes. This book is great, and yours should look like mine. Yours should be annotated, right? You should annotate. If you did it online, if you got the online version and you're renting it, take notes. And then you can just fly through these quizzes. But if you're saying this is not enough time, then I'm thinking you're not reading before you do it, right? Is my philosophy. Because there's people who get A's and they have it in 12 minutes, 15 minutes. So I just feel like you can do it. I know you can. Okay, so that's the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction era, the Reconstruction Amendments, and the lack of denazification in the United States, which sort of sticks us right where we are. So again, we would argue that civil rights wasn't at the end of the Civil War. We would argue that it's 1965, a whole 100 years later, when all of those, the equal rights laws were passed, and all of the Jim Crow actually ends in Jim Crow didn't end till 1965. Think about that, right? That's your parents' age, probably, right? Well, my parents' age. My parents were born in the 60s, right? Late 50s, early 60s, right? And they saw segregation, right? Your parents or grandparents, for sure, your grandparents for sure, right? My grandparents saw segregation, lived through segregation. You know, so this idea that African Americans were not given reparations and or weren't even given a start at American identity, access, healthcare, housing, anything, a bank account, colleges, any of that until 1965, right? It was a couple decades ago. It's recent. That's our lifetime, right? That's my lifetime. I was born in 70, right? Like that's a lifetime. It's now. Okay, so really keep this in mind. It's just a lot, and we're going to keep looking at the legacy of this. If we were in person, I would also talk to you about post-traumatic slave syndrome, which is a thing that you learn about when you take African American studies classes. And but if not, you can Google it. All right. So just interesting stuff to think about. And now that we're on week 6 out of 10, keep in mind you have this huge final project at the end, and start thinking of ideas. All right. All right. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you and all your work. Great, great, great job. See you next week.